background's military, as Anna said a second ago. So I did 25 years in the bomb squad with the Army, and I retired and effectively got hired on with Ray Secure, and I'm the CSO. So we look at physical threats as they show up in front of our clients primarily. There's a lot of things that we identified as gaps in information. That's where most of this data comes from, as we started filling in the gaps with our own data set. So we're going to go through the 2020 State of Mail Security and how to reopen and get things functioning again. Top 30,000-foot view, we're going to talk about U.S. and global statistics, case studies, examples, and then combating dangerous mail, and then we'll Q&A at the end. So here's where information generally comes from. If you're looking at a set of data that you pull from Postal Service, you pull from Bomb Data Center or whatever, this is the primary angle that you're going to see reporters pull information off of. The U.S. Official Dangerous Mail Data, that's Postal Inspection Service. They deal with mail threats and related crimes, but only when they're called. So their numbers are generally going to be smaller, and there's only 400 of them across the United States. So when you see numbers reported by the Postal Service, they're generally on the low side. We do interpret the official data, so we're going to look at this holistically and understand that the threshold might change with how some of these agencies report and how they identify certain threats, right? All right, so then we'll look at things at a global perspective and kind of how to look at what your threats are, vice what you perceive them to be based on numbers globally. So the 2020 mail report, the one that we run, is a single source of mail data. Basically, there's nobody out there that does across the board. This is just mail. So we collect all of our stuff from open source, and the numbers that I'm going to show you are from 2020. The numbers last year are going to be a little low because everybody's working from the home, but they do generally keep in stats for what we see year to year. We do provide this for actionable and timely intelligence. So normal official data will lag 6 to 12 months. For example, the Bomb Data Center's report for 2020, we're now in the third month of the year and it's not out yet. So we'll probably see theirs next month at some point, but that's the reason why we run our numbers the way we do. Generally speaking, the Postal Service, if you look at it, there's about 10 incidents per day that happen across multiple organizations and private entities. The USPIS, their 2019 report, again, 400 people that work for them as inspector, they have 3,200 incidents that went into their data set, went into their investigation background, and then 112,000 suspicious mail items. So that number is shockingly low. If you look at the Bomb Data Center, for example, they count 14,000 incidents, 900 of them. It's just to show the difference between what reporting happens, because different companies and different organizations look at the same bit of data differently. The Postal Service is only going to respond to USPS threats. Bomb Data Center is going to capture things, whether it's FedEx or UPS or whatever. Those numbers do hold true. They are a little bit low for 2019, and we expect 2021 is probably going to increase. So the regional risk profile that we look at, if you look at North America, right? If you look at somewhere a little more hazardous like Middle East, North Africa, they're 34 times more prevalent. They're going to have a threat than we do, right? That gives us a good idea where we look at globally, where we sit threat-based and where the United States is vice other countries. And I'll send these slides out afterwards so you can use them to poke through on your own questions. But that shows that Western Europe, for example, is 3 times more prevalent than North America. It makes sense. We've had a lot of North American vice companies that have Eastern European or Western European other facilities, and they're looking at threats. They're looking to figure out how they can mitigate them because the numbers are increasing, right? So mail bombing, this is from 2017. 2017 is the last open year the START Database Center had their data pushed, but that's effectively what it looks like. And this matches year to year. We now do an international look. So now from 2021 on, we're looking internationally as well. So about 6 months through the year, if you start looking at our data, you're going to see it propagate, and you'll see an up-to-date timeline on what's happening across the states. Letter bomb occurrence, same one. That's just broke down geographically, where they are, not by bubble chart, by size, but by physical location. All right, so this tells us that the trend is there, and it's still holding true. The dip in 2020 did go down globally, as you'd expect it to, but we're already seeing an uptick in 2020, 2021, and some of the responses are increasing actually in numbers. Let me skip past this one because it doesn't really say that much. All right, so the most common threats that we saw in 2020, 42% of the threats that we saw were white powder or other threats. So white powder doesn't necessarily mean it's anthrax. In fact, it's not. It generally is worst case ricin, which we saw happen to the White House last year. We saw a couple events where spouses were trying to kill their significant others with it. It's fairly hard to do, but most of the time it's benign powder. It's not something that's legitimately going to hurt anybody. 42% total were drugs. That's independent of the white powder events. So that is people no longer standing on street corners. Now, because of the COVID experience, now drug dealers are simply mailing in drugs. It has increased across the board. We expected 2020 to have that increase. It did happen, and we expect to see that continue into 2021. Even when the office spaces are open and people start going back into it, the drugs are primarily going to stick solely in the mail. Other powders, generally for the 4%, that's caustic items or when things are misidentified. Oftentimes, if somebody is doing their own mailers or they do a lot of mailing from their company, they'll end up with a lot of excess paper that turns into a powder style and it ends up in packages and it gets caught up as somebody turning it as white powder. Targets for the year, 42% is government. That showed a significant increase last year. One was because we had a fairly contentious election, and two, because the government is increasing its footprint in society. And people, when the government shut everybody down, they started reacting. So that's everybody from anti-vaxxers, not just in the States, but across the world, to people who are just angry because their militia can't meet this week, or they're upset because the government voted against them in something locally. So the government itself was a large target. And then we'll break out corrections and courts separately. Corrections, most of the times, that's people trying to mail stuff into jails that are illicit. That's a lot of synthetic marijuana, K2, that style of threat, mostly illicit. And then this court saw an increase this year where it was actually after judges, not necessarily after the courtroom, which is generally the target, but when 2020 rolled around and people started having judgments and liens held against them and started having foreclosures and things happen, judges were being targeted heavier as well. So those stats held pretty true. And we think in 2021, they're just going to increase and the government is going to become a larger target. We hit business and residents at 39%. That's probably going to increase because a lot of businesses just were not affected last year. When we talk about threats, most of the time, 95% to be exact, you end up with small packages. For us, the definition of a small package is less than half an inch thick and weighs less than 10 ounces. That's because that's the size that the U.S. Postal Service will accept into the collection bin with a couple stamps. One of the reasons why this is a number that's significant is every other way you want to mail something, whether it's FedEx, UPS, those are private companies. They don't have any requirements for your privacy. In fact, most of the time, if you try to deliver drugs through FedEx or UPS, for example, the person behind the counter is going to get a weird feeling and they're just going to open it up. And they're going to call the police right there or after you've walked out of the building. So to get something from point A to point B under the radar, it's going to be the Postal Service, and it's going to be with some stamps in a collection bin, which means you have to meet their criteria, 10 ounces, less than half an inch thick. 32% were letters this year. That number in 2021 is already increasing. I run the daily threat. We're up to 107 threats this year, and I think 75% of them are letters. People are reaching out with white powder and dropping it and sending it off to people they don't really care for. The big thing to notice is parcels and letters. Both of those numbers are most of the majority of the threats. That's not all the things that showed up. All the suspect items, that's in the thousands. All the ones that were legitimate, that were identified as being something as hazardous or illicit or a hoax, that is where those numbers come from. So that's the legitimate threat size. The response, this is important because it'll let you work with your SOPs and help you identify who you should expect to see, especially once you identify what the threat is. Once you look at something and go, okay, white powder, I'm going to get a hazmat team. Well, who else is going to show up? The numbers listed here are the ones that were in charge of the site. So when hazmat teams show up, they don't ever do their own cordon and security. So the police department is going to be there. We list them out because they're the lead agency, the one who's making decisions on the actual site itself. So the numbers are fairly telling, but the biggest two to pay attention to is your hazmat, they're good, but the big two is the EOD bomb squad and the FBI. Those two numbers are viable threats, are the ones that are showing up. 20% of the time, it's viable enough to bring a bomb squad in. And then the FBI, 13% on mail crime, that's a significant increase. That's because there was a lot of extortion last year. There was a lot of hate crime last year. and there was an increase in the amount of illicit threats that were just sent through the mail. Right? I've mentioned this before, small threats, lack of chain of custody, that 10 ounces and half an inch thick, that's where most of the threats are rotating to. Ted Kaczynski, if you think back to Unabomber times, those were shoebox size. In fact, I started the bomb squad in 94. That's what everybody was worried about, something about the size of the shoebox. We always trained to that. Now it's flat packages. For another, just a general statement, bombs don't tick anymore. You're not going to hear anything ticking or noise on the inside. 99% of the time, if it's a circuit running, it's going to be a 555 timer, and you won't know that it's going inside of there. But the bombs of them have changed significantly. That's another talk. One of the things that come up in the last couple of years, but very serious last year with all the things that turned into mail or that was shifting towards mail, was the chain of custody and the last mile style threat. And I'll show you a couple of those in a minute. But basically, it's third parties that are paid to get the package from, it's his last mile, but the last little bit. So whether that's an Amazon delivery person in front of your house at 9 o'clock at night in their personal vehicle, not wearing the purple vest, taking a picture of your front porch and then put a package down, or whether it's truly a third person or a third party that's been hired by the local Amazon distributor to get all their stuff delivered. Last mile style threats are an increased problem, and they're going to continue to be so because we don't have this understanding that we did in the past where all my mail showed up from the USPS. Now, everybody and anybody can make money to get them to you, and as much stuff is being bought and put through the mail, it's just going to continue to happen. All right, so let's look at a couple case studies from the last year. Subway's a good incident because it shows major corporations how they get hung out to dry even when they do everything right. So in 2020, Subway laid off approximately 200 workers a little early on in the pandemic, right? It was in February, March. Everybody kind of knew it was coming. That layoff wasn't tied to the pandemic. It was tied to the company's been struggling with keeping themselves, in the right side of the checks and balances sheet. So they did something strategically correct for the company. The day that this white powder threat rolled in, there was about 20 people on the site, and the news agencies, not the local news, 24 hours, they said something happened, it was over. When it got to CNN, Fox, and everybody else, they blamed it immediately on the firings. Okay, I guess you could make that assumption. Subway did not, but that's what they did. The next thing that happened is the recent problems they had, like Jared Fogle, that come up to the forefront. So it's nothing to do with the white powder. This wasn't even proved to be an insider threat, which is what the original assessment was. This was just somebody who mailed some powder off to Subway and never even identified themselves. The news agencies blame corporate, and a lot of companies nowadays are worried about things like this. Everything in your past will come up, and they're going to say, whatever you've done before, that's the reason why it's shown up now, right? So we all heard about President Trump and his incident with Ricin last year. Interesting fact, every presidency has had a Ricin event show up at the White House since Bush Jr., since 2003. It's happened every single presidency. So with this event, there was one White House letter that did contain Ricin. It was a threat. Previously, there was 6 letters that she sent off to detention centers and law enforcement in Texas. She has family in Texas. She had been caught in Texas with an illegal driver's license. That's the picture you see. Effectively, what this does, it proves the point that if you don't deal with the problem when it first hits and it increases, it's just going to escalate to worse and worse outcomes. So where she was kept in Texas, I think it was 6 or 8 months earlier, and had made some complaints, nobody really did anything about it because it was just this crazy Canadian woman. And then as you work your way down the line, you start looking at what she said September 9th about somebody who's shooting Trump in the face. That's reaching out. That's a viable increase in threats. And you can see what she was charged with. She is going through the United States courts, and she's going to stay in our courts. But this is a great example of something escalating, and if you don't kind of keep an eye on it, it can get pretty significant. Are there any questions up to this point? I'm trying to go quick. I got 15 minutes left. Oh, okay. Mail-in ballots. This is, again, contentious last year. So there was mail-in ballot threats across the states. They're more worried about it than what actually happened. I know we spoke to many of the polling sites and many of the election agencies who were worried about something significant happening. And the worst that we saw was a few things, racist notes and white powder. One thing that did happen is the bottom one. I'll bring that one up. Grand Island, Nebraska. A gentleman ran a dry run on an election commission. Sent in something that, if you filled it up, it was a motor, a pump, a tube, and some blue liquid that was set to go off when you opened it up. And that was a dry run to see what would happen. He did get arrested. He did get federally charged, and he is sitting in a federal detention center right now. But his goal was to just go after ballots, remove as many as humanly possible. So I mentioned the last mile style threat. This is a great example of it. This happened in September. Individual placed a package on the front door of this home about 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning on the day of the attack. The individual who was targeted, his mother, picked up the package and brought it in and put it on top of the kitchen table. It sat there for the entire day. The target got home about 5:30 at night, picked up the package, took it into his room, which is outside the window where you see the part of the shingles falling there, and opened the package and it detonated. Recently, it's come to find out it's actually interesting. It was anti-tamper, anti-movement device, so it was victim operated. But the interesting thing that this individual was targeted because of LARPing. There was I don't know if you've ever heard of LARPing, but it's live action role play. There was a love triangle, and that is what caused this bomb to get delivered. Everybody assumed it was drugs or something that was related to gangs, but the reality it wasn't. It was somebody who felt they were crossed. Ideological motivation, there was a lot of that this year, and it's going to be expected to stay high in the upcoming years. So this is an example of a church that wasn't shut down as early as some of the people who worked around it believed it should have been. The pastor actively said, I'm not going to shut my church, and ended up with a last mile threat at their front door, listed or effectively aimed at the pastor. Shut the facility down, shut everybody down. The state shut it down in the beginning, or shut it down eventually when California mandated it. But if you're running something that can be seen externally as having an ideological question, or you don't necessarily are going against the group, expect something to come and show up on your front porch. The bottom two here, I'll send the slides out so you can read them. Black Lives Matter was targeted heavily this year. Baltimore, NAACP, and several other NAACP headquarters were hit with threatening letters pretty much the entire year. As soon as the protests started, there was another campaign that went on behind the scenes, and those were directly aimed at leaders, individuals who represented Black Lives Matter, and individuals that represented anything that was ideological in nature. Since then, now since January 6th has come up, there's been 6 of the lawyers, to include their whole law offices, that are representing people who trespassed onto the Capitol building that have been targeted now. So it's shifted from Black Lives Matter to now they're going after lawyers who are representing people, both sides of the line. Illegal or illicit materials. A lot of this stuff gets called a victimless crime, but in reality, what it ends up being is a pain for most people who run their own mailroom. Hoaxes, drugs, weapons. I've got pictures of lizards. There's all sorts of stuff that ends up in the mail. Most of the companies nowadays are looking for this stuff to get it out of their mail because it's actually a crime a lot of times. And they want to make sure it's not being done to the company. So I know what goes on in my house. My wife, for example, laughed at me like a month ago when I got my my jury summons because she knew it was coming. It was, she got a readout or a scan of it in her email before it showed up. So a lot of people now track at the house. That means a lot of the things that are illicit are now going to the office space. If you work with 500 people, you can expect that some of them have a problem. And if their significant others are aware of it, that problem will probably show up at the office. It's not necessarily going to show up at the house. Another thing that bring up recently is Wish.com. I don't know if you ever looked at it, but it's a Chinese Amazon equivalent. You can buy things for very, very cheap. You can also buy things that are very illegal for very cheap. Wish.com comes from China. There's fairly straightforward marketing and marking on it. But a lot of their items, people go to that site and not Amazon because, yes, it's cheap, but there is also a lot of items that would be illegal or illicit coming from there. A lot of weapons, magazines, silencers, things of that sort. Globally, and then I'm going to talk about some post-COVID stuff. So globally, this is what's happened in 2021. Germany's had 3 letter bombs or go off since. There's been a few other ones. AstraZeneca was hit. We all saw that one on the news by an anti-vaxxer. He's now with federal charges. If you back up white powder threats in Canada across vaccine locations. It happened effectively around the world. So we've had these incidents. They continue to happen, and mail continues to be a bigger problem for larger corporations and companies. One of the primary reasons for this is because people can absolutely reach out without having to put themselves in an immediate threat. You build something, you put something inside of a package, you mail it in, there's a feeling of anonymity or safety. And that's what people rely on. And it's not just here in the States, it's global. All of the companies on the right have been hit in the last 6 months, and that's a small number. Most of the times you don't even really see them hitting the news. All right, so, well, that's 2020 threats. Kind of run through quickly. Usually this is an hour and a half. Are there any questions before we start talking about how to open back up after the pandemic? Oh, okay. So one thing that we have, and a lot of companies are back to working. They're back to the mailrooms were not shuttered in many offices. But what we're going back to is the new normal. I've enjoyed the lack of traffic, but in the empty office space, it's great. But the other side is, hey, we have to make normal. We have to figure this out. So with that being said, there's some new things that you have to pay attention to inside of your mailroom or inside of your facility. And one of those is contamination control. Let's assume everything we're talking about is a white powder threat. Let's just, because it ties to our threat, but it's also something valid that we can talk through. And this applies to COVID or applies to anything if you're trying to keep people from contaminating. You have to control contamination. That means you have to control through the spread of that white powder letter getting put on the desk or on the screening area and being spread from that point to another. Every time it picks up, it's going to spread from another point to another point. You have to control that. So that is through the act of touch or through the act of transfer. Transfer is from one surface to another. So that's things when you pick them off of, you put that white powder letter down and you move it to another site. Then you put your bag down on top where the white powder letter was. Now your bag is now contaminated and you move your bag to a chair. Now the chair is contaminated. That's transfer. So these are very tactical and very deliberate tasks that you have to pay attention to in the normal environment, because every time you touch or do something, you're going to cause an increase in contamination, increase in problems. The next one, not through white powder, obviously, but we have a few incidents in the last year where people have sent in items that do off gas or to produce a vapor that's spread through the air current. Oftentimes, these are batteries or hazardous material events that happen, especially since COVID. A lot of things that were not allowed to go through the mail, like lithium-ion batteries, like DieCads and other things that aren't necessarily the easiest things to take care of or the easiest things to handle, they're in the mail now. So we have a lot of items that are just off-gassing on their own. And the last one is desorption, which is contamination transferred through porous surfaces. That's the porous part of your desk sucking in and pulling on contamination in it. All of these are required for you to make sure that you pay attention to what's going on with them and to clean them and make sure that they're not contaminated, not contaminating other places. So previous to COVID, we were out there with no real safety controls. Nobody really paid attention to things like particle transmission, contamination control, cleaning procedures, how to do PPE. I retired from the military in 2019 in January, and I effectively came into this place right away. And I watched our trainer try to get people to wear dust masks and wear gloves on training events on a regular basis. And people looked at her, yep, that's great. And then they wouldn't do it. Now, masks are pretty easy because everybody's wearing for another reason. But the reality is mail is still as dirty as it was before. There's still a lot of really bad stuff you can get inside your system by not wearing PPE and making sure you're good. Contamination control methods are not just how to maintain your facility's cleanliness, but how to make sure your interaction with it is the best possible approach. So where we're trying to get to, EPA and OSHA came out with mandatory safety standards for workplaces. Everybody's seen these. We're all should be looking at the 6-foot step marks when we go to the grocery store. Everybody knows what 6 foot looks like. Not everybody has collapsed themselves on top of their organization or on top of their company to plan that out, right? That is a deliberate effort that you have to put together, and that's a deliberate thought process. And it's different for each facility. So we talk to facilities all the time who say things like, I am a co-use building. I have 15 people that work here. and I own 1/3 of the floor. Okay, well, you can only affect change in that 1/3, but you can affect change. You can put these policies in place. A lot of workplaces are changing to rotational, where you don't have a set office anymore. Now it's not fixed. Somebody else will come in, it's flex. And then you have cleaning that's been increased. So there's a lot of things that are changing. The best thing to do is be flexible with it. A lot of our clients were doing reworking of standard operating procedures that have been in place for 2 years because that standard operating procedure just doesn't apply anymore. Whatever you have in the books, it no longer works. Instead of the 35 people, now you have 5, and you have all the same tasks to do. In fact, you probably increase them a little bit. With that said, that there's some planning opportunity here, and a lot of what is going on, and a lot of what happened in the last year through COVID when nobody was in the office, has been a lot of planning. People are trying to figure out how to get after this next problem and how to handle it properly. With this, we talk a lot about strategic planning and how to model it, implement change, measure it, learn from what your measurements were, refine it, put back in a feedback loop, and identify how to make it better. So we've been talking to a lot of our clients and talking to a lot of the people that opened back up or could not close throughout the pandemic. And about the best one that we've found that works for most of the companies is this setup. So it's a hub and spoke approach that it doesn't really, it does matter how many people are there, but if you have more, it's a bit easier. It's a collaborative effort, but basically the mail center or your logistical footprint is the place that touches almost everybody inside the company, whether that's the C-suite, HR professionals that come down to grab mail for the CEO, or whether it's coming from legal and you've got to transmit documents from the CEO off to HR because you're letting people go. Whatever it ends up being, that ends up being the most contaminated place is the mail center. So if you work with a hub and spoke approach where the C-suite, for example, comes at a particular point in time during the day, and that's it. They're done. That's what they get. Management shows up the next time. So you don't have cross-pollination of organizations. So the operational side isn't going to get the legal side in a 14-day, assuming nobody has their shots, but a 14-day, what is it when you contain yourself for 14 days? I'm having a brain fart. Quarantine. Thank you. I lost the word. We've all done it. I lost it. So that 14-day quarantine, your ops section is not going to take your legal section out. Logistically, it just makes sense. One thing that we have heard consistently from our clients, though, is that it's got to be supported by management. Usually the mail center people, the operations people, they'll come up with this plan and go, look, CEO team, you've got from 8 to 9 in the morning. And then you work your way through. Nobody shows up except for during designated time. And then the CEO's assistant shows up at 3 p.m. If the management isn't supporting this, you end up with a contamination control issue. One thing that we've talked about is companies that are opening up or they've been closed for a while. There's another problem, and this has been the successful way for them to handle it. How to triage the backlog. So we've got companies that have 5 months, 6 months of shuttered business, or they're working on that much of a lag. Look at the Postal Service itself. I watched a thing last night that said it was a 2-day mailer the reporter sent from New York to DC. It took 10 days. Imagine that in your own organization. It's going to be the same thing. So when you triage it, that's where some of the questions come out that apply. Do you do oldest or newest first? If you do oldest first, let's say you have a back bill and you're going to get your first warning. Well, if it takes you 2 weeks to get to the end and then you get to the newest and that's the last bill that just shut off your power, you'd like to have known that earlier. So oftentimes going from the newest mail, working your way back, some of those rubber balls, they'll bounce more than the glass ones will. Go through and have an MOU put in place with your employees if you're opening back up that allows just your immediate removal of items. If it's a 6-month-old magazine or a 4-month-old mailer for something that's out of date, just a signed MOU or a statement saying, hey, we're going to get rid of a lot of this stuff that doesn't actually apply. Identifying critical infrastructure requirements. So identifying things like, we used to only get hand sanitizer in the size of a shoebox once every 3 weeks when it showed up from whatever company we use. Now we're getting a pallet because we're sending it off to everybody's homes. When everybody walks in the company, we're handing them a bottle of it. We're going through stuff like so tomorrow. Well, you have to plan for a pallet. And a lot of companies aren't necessarily set up for that. And those large deliveries are becoming more normal, where companies, instead of having the 30-day on hand for whatever, they're bumping it up to 60 or 90 because that's when they could get it scheduled to be delivered. Some of these items are just harder to get nowadays, and you're going to end up holding more and more of them for a longer period of time. All right. So the last thing we'll hit on really quick is PPE. A lot of people have some misunderstandings or misnomers with it. Like the one on the left side here, that is not helping anybody else but the individual wearing it. If you're working in your workspace and you see 6 people working in a fairly small environment and they've got one of those N95s with the relief valve on it, every bit of exhale that person is doing is going to the room in mass. They're not protecting anybody, like I said, but themselves. The disposable masks, as long as they're N95, they do a great job. I'm repeating everything the news has said, but in an environment that's critical to, success and critical to operations, it's also critical to keep people safe and healthy. So PPE is critical. And then the other one that we see all the time is understand trade-offs between gloves and hand washing. I'm going to go back to, just to give you an analogy, when you're running a chemical munition and you're in the Army and you're doing all this stuff and it's great, and you're there to handle a chemical problem, as soon as somebody puts on a protective mask and gloves, they start touching random parts of their body. I don't know what it is, but as soon as you put gloves on, people go, okay, I'm safe, and then they touch their face. Well, they've just been touching what you're trying to keep from contaminating people, and the first thing they do is rub their ears, and they do everything like that. It's not a rule, but it is generally a true fact that if you hand wash and sanitize, you will have less contamination problems than if you're wearing gloves. It's just the way people act. If you're trying to keep the contamination control to a minimum, it is helpful to keep those thought processes in place when you apply stuff. All right, I think I'm on time. Any questions beyond that?
Thank you so much. Y'all can see my screen now. That was a great presentation. I had some representatives from our mailroom online too.